All right, so far in looking at the argument from evil, we have a similar structure to what we did with the argument from design. We first lay the argument out in complete and hopefully logically strong form to get a sense for the power of the argument, and then we turn to developing strong criticisms or responses to the argument in a way that tries to weaken the force of the argument and preserves the original position we're trying to intend here. In this unit, I want to add one more level of complexity and introduce counter-arguments as well. This takes us further along in our philosophical methodological development. Of course, it's one thing to lay out an argument. Clearly, it's another thing then to consider possible logical and strong criticisms of that argument. But in many cases, that's still a preliminary stage to what is then a longer process of argumentative give and take, and things go back and forth. So we have arguments, responses, and now I want to turn to counters or counter-arguments. Right? Not to say that this would be the final stage in working through the argument from evil consistently and thoroughly. There might then be another column of responses to the counter-arguments, whatever the material is necessary. But for sake of argument and for the pleasure of the exercise, let's consider the strength of these arguments. We can feel the force of the argument here, and we have four responses to it here. If any of these responses are strong and legitimate, then they do weaken the power of this argument and make it possible for there to be both a God that exists in a world that contains evil. So let's take the responses in turn and kick them around a little bit to try to get a sense for their force. All right, so this one is then to say initially that God, being a perfect being, would not create a perfect world. This position is to say that God did in fact create a perfect world as an expression of his own perfection, and so the imperfections can't be assigned to God because they come from human beings who use their free will in inappropriate ways. All right, how strong a response is that? It certainly fits with mainstream theology. Much of mainstream theology, not all of it though, will agree that human beings have free will and that God intentionally created us with free will. And so it does seem make sense to say certainly much of the evil that occurs in the world is a result of human free will. Serial killers, pipe bombers, right, and so forth. Well, one standard counter-response here is to say with regard to response one, right, as we'll call it here, try to keep in order, is to say that the free-willed response doesn't account for all of the evil in the world. We have to then still raise the question about what about the naturally bad things, right, that exist in the world, right? The diseases, the earthquakes, the hurricanes and so forth that come through and kill a lot of people. It doesn't seem right to say that human free will is caused as the cause of those things, for example. So to the extent that there are naturally bad things that exist in the world that aren't the result of human causation, they're part of the world that God created, and so it would then seem that God is responsible. So we can raise the question, isn't God responsible then, and so not off the hook, right, for those things? Well, we can make various kinds of arguments, like some people will say in this case that, well, the case of a maternity ward in a hospital that was built in this particular city, human beings knew that that was an earthquake zone, that there was a fault line that was running along that particular line, so they chose to build the hospital there, and so it still is their fault that the hospital collapsed in that particular case, and the horrible things that happened to the infants as a result of that. All right, so that argument then can go back and forth, right, a little bit further. Another possible response, though, to the free will argument here, or a counter-argument to it, is to say that even so, if God created us with free will, God being an omniscient being, he created us knowing that some or all of us would use our free will in certain ways, and so he then intentionally brought us forward into the world knowing that people like Ted Bundy, the serial killer, and Adolf Hitler would use their free will for evil. Why would he do that? All right, so there's a question here, right? Why, right, then would God, as a creator, bring forth, right, those who will use their free will for great evil? For example, is a kind of a silly example, but I think it makes the point interestingly here. There are people who use their free will for evil in the following sense, that they might speed on occasion, not pay their parking tickets, and fudge their taxes. Okay, fine. That's an abuse of free will that those people bring into existence. Perhaps God has reasons why he allows people to do those sorts of bad things. But what about someone like Adolf Hitler? Why would God allow him to exist knowing the scale on which Adolf Hitler is going to use his evil? And it seems like given his knowledge and his goodness and his power, it would have been a fairly simple thing for him to not have allowed Adolf Hitler to come into existence. So back in the 1880s or whenever it was when Hitler is conceived, there's the night when Mr. Hitler and Mrs. Hitler go to bed, and they meet in their bedroom. And God knows with his omniscience that if they have sex on that night, this particular sperm is going to meet the egg and Adolf Hitler will be conceived. And he knows the consequences of all of that, and that those are terribly evil consequences. And so he does a little nudging action here. Mrs. Hitler suddenly has a headache, and she says to her husband, "Not tonight, dear, I have a headache." So they don't get together that evening. Instead, they get together in the following evening. A different sperm meets the egg, and a conception occurs. And 9 months later, a little boy is born who is named Adolf, right? But of course, it's a different Adolf who comes into existence, and there is no Holocaust. Okay. Now, somewhat fanciful example here, but why couldn't God have arranged, the question would be, for those beings who come into existence with free will only be human beings who will mostly use their existence, or their free will rather, for good, and only for moderate amounts of evil. And now, of course, the response to that then might be, and this will be on the counter response here, I don't have a big enough board for this, to say, well, God can't stage manage things that way. If God is going to give us free will, it has to be a blank check kind of free will. It can't be a stage managed kind of free will if it's going to be legitimate, so it's an all or nothing sort of deal, and the argument can then go back and forth. Now we can then say, okay, well, fine. Why can't God just nudge things in a different way that doesn't really override people's free will? It leaves them genuine free will, and he doesn't choose the people who are going to come into existence as a result of other people's free will. But why can't God, say, do something like the following? Suppose Ted Bundy is stalking a young woman whom he plans to make as his next victim. And so there he is, he's standing in the dark alley, and the girl is at the club, and it's getting late, and he knows that her habit is to leave the club at a certain point and walk alone, cut through this alley on her way home, and so he's waiting in there for her. And so what God does is, at the moment the girl leaves the club, he knows Ted Bundy is about to pounce, and so he just intervenes for a few seconds as the girl is passing by, paralyzes Ted Bundy so he can't actually move. The girl passes through the alley and out the other side, and then Ted Bundy's opportunity is lost. Okay, now it's a minor overriding of free will, certainly, right, so to speak, but Ted Bundy still nonetheless gets a chance to exist, and he nonetheless doesn't get to do the damage on that particular case. Yeah, if God is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent, why wouldn't he do so if he could do so? Any decent person would do that to Ted Bundy if they knew the consequences. All right, interesting set of issues here about the free will response. My point is in part just to point out that there are those issues, but to make the methodological point. Argument, criticism, counter response, and then we kick that around and we make an assessment. Finally, how strong is the free will response? Does it get God off the hook for responsibility and lay it on humans or not?